Welcome to The Wonder, exploring perspectives, rituals, and observances of modern, naturalistic, earth-revering, pagan religious paths. Here are your hosts, Yucca and Mark.
Welcome back to The Wonder, Science-Based Paganism. I'm your host, Mark.
And I'm Yucca.
And today we're talking about truth and reality.
Yes. So there's a lot to talk about here.
There is. And that's why we chose this topic, right? Because a lot of the places where we come into friction with other parts of the pagan community, and certainly friction with other religious perspectives other than atheism, is in the question of what is real and what is true, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I want to start out with is that we have terrible language for this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Very imprecise language that uses one word to describe a lot of different things.
Right. I want to start also with a little story from something my father used to say when I was little. And I don't know where he got it from, but when he would tell a story and I would ask him, I'd say, "Dad, is this a true story?" He would say, "Yes. The events didn't happen, but this is a true story."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like fables, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fables that illustrate moral principles. The moral principles may be something that we want to subscribe to, but that doesn't mean that the story about the chicken that was afraid that the
Sky was falling, or
really
that
ever
nobody would
happened.
help her make bread, or there's a lot of chicken ones.
Are there?
Yeah, right.
You would know more than me.
But so when we say that word true, it can mean so many different things,
Yes.
right? Sometimes we mean it as, is it correct, as in a mathematical problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is 2 plus 2 equals 5? Is that true or not, right? But we can also mean, is it true in that more, does it have importance? Does it have meaning? So,
Or even in very broad philosophical senses, like, is it true that supply side trickle down economics benefits everyone in the society?
mhm,
And some people will say, yes, that's true. I think the evidence is that it does not. But ultimately, it comes down to what you believe and what the underpinnings of that belief are, what your philosophies are, right?
right,
So when I say truth, I used to just mean the objectively factual, the verifiable, right?
so sort of like a positivist approach to truth,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So what is
So,
real can be verified empirically, and the best approach to find it is the scientific method, right?
right,
That would be
right.
our positivism. Yeah.
That is true of phenomena in the objective universe outside of our skins. The earth is round-ish. It's not flat. Doesn't matter what you believe about it, it's still roundish and not flat, right?
Hmm.
We have overwhelming evidence that this is the case. And so it's not 100% sure, because nothing in science is ever 100% sure, but there's so much evidence that it's not considered an open question at this point. It's considered settled
Right.
science. It's a fact, right? But when you get to truths like justice and morality and good, there are truths in there too, but they're much more rooted in the philosophy and belief system of the person that's expressing them and the culture that they grew up in
Hmm.
than it is about something that can be measured and factually checked against other alternatives, right?
Right. And while we're giving things labels, that would be more of a constructivist philosophical approach, right? That those beliefs are constructed from the society that you're part of and your experience and your species, and that all of those things are building on each other to create reality or to create truth.
Right, right. Your familial ideological context, all of those things accrete
Mm-hmm.
to form something that more or less hangs together as a philosophical belief system, right?
Right.
So that, I think, is a part of the reason why it becomes very difficult to talk about what is true. Because as you say, the story, the events may not have happened, but the story can still be true. And that's why myth is so important to us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are the storytelling apes, as we've said before. And telling stories, even science tells stories. Science,
Oh,
tells,
absolutely. That's what it's about. There's very strict
yes,
rules about how you tell that story, but
right,
that's what we're doing. Yeah.
right. Yeah. It tells, chronological, procedural steps, events that take place where, something becomes something else or something comes into being.
Mm-hmm.
And and so it's important for us to recognize, I think, the value that storytelling has for us in the abstract,
Mm-hmm.
because just because something is not objectively factual doesn't mean that it can't be emotionally moving, morally eye-opening in perspective,
Mm-hmm.
broadening your understanding of the human condition and the life that we live. So all of those things are true, right? And none of them is, can be subjected to a gas chromatograph.
Mm-hmm.
You can't you can't measure those kinds of things.
Right.
So I actually made a little Venn diagram using the wrong tool for making Venn diagrams. I used Microsoft Word earlier today, and I've got four circles. I've got objectively verifiable facts, I've got believed truth, cultural truth, and then what overlaps all three of those is personal reality.
How are you distinguishing between the believed and cultural?
Well, here's a good example. The cultural truth of the United States is Christian.
Okay.
It is, that is, the cultural truth is what I would call the overculture.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the individual's personal reality might vary from that, the believed truth.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't subscribe to many of the values or even cosmological beliefs of the cultural truth, but we do, and so we have our own believed truth.
Okay.
That makes sense.
That does, yeah. So just getting a sense of how you're using those words.
Yeah, and this once again is where language is just really not very useful. I mean, having to use all these qualifiers for words like truth and real and fact and things like that is it's frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
And because I have spoken a couple of other languages, I know that it's not entirely capturing what I'm trying to say.
Right.
We don't have quite the right words in our language to capture what I want to say.
Though I don't know if any language, some might have words that are better fit, but language is just something that we're trying to use to communicate these ideas, but the ideas are language isn't enough, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that it's helpful for us to try to articulate it anyways, because that forces us to clarify our thinking around it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We can't just throw a word on it and say that's what it is. Right? We
Right.
have to really think about what are we trying to actually say. And that's tricky because we're trying to think about our own process of thinking. which is
Yes.
far more challenging than it sounds like on the surface. And then put down and think about other people's approach to it. And of course, we are just these limited beings, right? We don't experience everything. We only get to be around for to exist for a very short period of time. And most of the time that we're existing for, we're not even conscious for.
Right. And our brains constantly edit, massage, invent, fill in the blanks of our perceptual array, filter our perceptions in order to create an inner model of the universe that we can interact with, right? And so we can determine that things are true when there's very little evidence that relates to them. Even people conclude that things are objectively true, like ghosts and spirits and
Mm-hmm.
gods and stuff like that, with very little evidence, but they will conclude that it's true because they have experiences that are filtered through their own filtration process that will make what appears to be evidence for them.
Right.
And while I tend to be very, very skeptical about those kinds of processes and skeptical, when I have an experience that strikes me as violating the laws of physics, and I have had a few,
Mm-hmm.
um, my immediate question is, okay, what went wrong with my sensorium? How did I misperceive this and misinterpret what it meant? Others may not do that.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I also wanted to talk about today is the way that we relativistically value certain kinds of truth
Mm-hmm.
relative to other kinds of truth, which is a cultural thing. And I think that particularly in the West, with our domination of science and technology and the kind of linear thinking,
Mm-hmm.
what's the word I'm looking for when you take things apart?
Reductionist.
Reductionist.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm looking for. The we tend to,
Dogmatic reductionism.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, we tend to place that which can be verified up on kind of a pedestal as being somehow more important than the other flavors of truth, the other varieties of truth
Mm-hmm.
that we experience in our lives. And what's weird about that is that in an actual human life, that's not how it works at all. I mean, yes, when you're young, it's useful to be able to determine, what a fire is so you don't burn yourself with it. But as we get older, the questions that we ask ourselves are, what does this feel like?
Mm-hmm.
Does this feel like the right thing to do? Is this moral? Is this just? Is this kind? Those kinds of questions. And those are things that there is no meter to measure.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So I think, for example, about, like, take the Lord of the Rings, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a semi-sacred text to many people. There are lots of folks out there who read it every year and are, deeply steeped in the whole lore of
My family read
Tolkien's.
it every single year.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. You know, just immersed in the beauty of and the drama of Tolkien's imaginary world. Now, Middle Earth doesn't really, I hate to break this to you, but
Yeah.
Middle Earth really doesn't exist to our knowledge in any material sense.
Right. It was, loosely based off of Europe, but not in the sense that of an actual. You can't go and say, oh, Mount Doom is Vesuvius or something. Like it doesn't
Right,
actually line up.
right.
It was meant more to be it in spirit, right, than
Yes.
in
Uh-huh.
physical body. So,
Right. But it can be profoundly impactful on us emotionally and even in terms of our thinking about ethical questions, moral questions. What would Galadriel do? So I think that the discounting of the mythological, the fictional, but still containing kernels of meaningful human knowledge narratives that we have, and certainly the culturally developed principles like fairness and justice and so forth. I mean, these are very important.
Mm-hmm.
And even though you can't measure them, it's still very important. And I think that we, especially as atheists, we can get accused of over emphasizing the material positivist, verifiably extant stuff
Right.
relative to the rest.
I think there has to be a balance too, though,
Mm-hmm.
because so many times we have seen people's that reality, that approach being valued over some of what's objectively happening, right? We think in ecology, right? There was a cultural belief about predators being bad. And we went and got rid of the predators. That did not help the ecosystem, though.
Mm-mm.
Objectively, the predators had to be there. Same thing with the grazers, right? We take the grazers out, we take the predators out, the system falls apart. No matter how much you believe about, oh, the poor little deer,
Right.
right? Like the system still falls apart if you take the predators out.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
so I think that it's a tricky balance when looking at and trying to figure out how to make choices, how to balance what knowledge we're looking at, how are we approaching the cultural versus some of the objective, and not saying that one is better than the other, but that there are places for each of those.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going with this, because what I'm expressing is that I think that we need to elevate the value of the mythic,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not an excuse for scientific illiteracy.
Right.
We having a good story about the nature of reality is not the same thing as having good knowledge about the nature of reality. And unfortunately, there are an awful lot of people out there who simply choose, okay, I'm going to go with this story. I'm going to go with this story about, this resurrection and
Mm-hmm.
original sin and virgin births and all that kind of stuff. Or I'm going to go with a story about Odin, or I'm going to go with a story about, anyway, name
Right.
your divinity of choice, right?
Well, and I
Um,
would like to say that I don't think it's just within believing in deities or things like that, but people will also do things, stories that don't really line up with current scientific understanding,
oh
but is
yeah.
they like their version of, and I see this with a lot of like the really kind of aggressive atheists who like they get this idea of like this is what science says, and it's like yeah, that's like an 18th century understanding. Like
Mm-hmm.
science has progressed, you know,
Yeah.
significantly since then, but you're going with this one story and you're deciding that that's what it is and not deviating. Like
Right.
that's
Right.
not how science works.
And similarly, many critics of science will point back to scientific thought and statements from 150 years ago and say, well, science is just racist. It's a colonialist, racist ideology, and that's all that it is. So you can discount it.
Yeah, which is
And
no, it the people who were doing science
yes,
existed within a cultural context and sometimes abused the tools to their own end.
right.
Yeah. And that's
Um,
happening today too,
yes,
right?
it is.
But our
Yes, it is.
responsibility as informed citizens and as scientists is to not let that happen
Mm-hmm.
when we see it, and most importantly, to recognize doing it.
Absolutely. And so, as I am so fond of saying, the solution to bad science is more and better science.
Right.
It's not to throw that whole system out and say, okay, let's just go with a story we made up.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, and understanding that, you know, deliberately choosing to believe in a world that is populated by invisible beings and has, invisible forces that you can manipulate in order to affect the course of events and stuff like that. I mean, I can understand why that's attractive in some ways. It's very
Romantic.
romantic. That's exactly the word. But it doesn't really reflect what we understand. And my paganism, my spirituality is deeply rooted in the idea that I want to be here.
Mm-hmm.
I love the stories, I love the movies, I love all that stuff. But I want to be connected with the reality of what this life experience is as best I can, and to celebrate and be wowed by that.
Right. And that's something that we've talked about a lot on the podcast, and
Mm-hmm.
we should do another wow and wonder episode, right, where
We
we share
should.
some of that stuff. But
Yeah.
that our reality is unbelievable. It is amazing. It's whatever scale you look at it. I mean, just wow,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can just go down and down into the single drop of water and all of the complex, incredible interactions and creatures that exist in that single drop of water, all the way up to the scale of the observable universe. It's just, there's so much. And we could spend every moment of our waking life discovering more and more and still not even begin to scratch the surface. And that's just, it's incredible. Everything that every day when I learn a new thing, it's just amazing. It's just wow, wow, wow. This is
Yeah.
so personally, I don't feel like I need the invisible beings. Like, and
Yeah.
if they're there, that's cool. Like, I'd love to discover them. But in the meantime, like I'm I'm pretty happy with tardigrades. It's pretty amazing,
Yep,
right?
they sure are. Yeah, I feel, unsurprisingly, I feel the same way. The if there are if there is a supernatural dimension to reality,
Mm-hmm.
or a dimension in which the kinds of things that theists and believers in magic subscribe to, whether or not it's natural, maybe there are other physical laws that apply in that context or something. There's little enough evidence for it that I can ignore it. I I will cheerfully pay attention to the stuff for which there is abundant evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have time in this life to go sifting through all of that, much less deal with stuff that may or may not be there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's a very sort of pragmatic decision to make, as well as a philosophical one, right? It's just like, well, I wouldn't want to spend a whole lot of time on something that turned out not to be there. So I'm just going to look at this gigantic pile of amazing stuff.
So
Uh,
pragmatic critical realism? Is
yes,
that where we're getting to?
something like,
Okay.
yeah, something like. But I do want to say that I mean, part of the problem that we have, I think, with religiosity, at least certainly in the United States, is that people are subscribing to religion and then turning off any curiosity, and deliberately resisting any curiosity from a scientific standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
How does this work? What makes this that way? And they've got this magical wand that they wave at it that said the gods did it, or God did it.
Mm-hmm.
And what that enables them to do then is to fill their world perspective with stuff that clashes vehemently with the evidence that we have, like people that are climate change deniers, and
Mm-hmm.
flat earth folks, and those kinds of things. um
The second one is the one that always just make like I can understand the first one about the climate change one, right? But the flat earth one, like you can see it, right?
Only
Like,
if you believe that we've ever launched anything from earth.
but like you can see the horizon.
Yeah,
Like
sure.
that's the one that I'm like, well, but you can literally see it with your own, like the climate stuff you've got to like you've got to trust that the data that's being collected is, blah 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 blah, right? But you can use your own eyes to verify that the Earth is not flat, that it's
Sure.
not spherical, right? And that's the one that I just it gets me. I'm just like, it's just, y'all, this is not like,
I,
I know
I
that you're saying that you don't want to trust all of these like crazy, that we're all in on some huge conspiracy to like trick you and make Photoshop documents and stuff, but like you can do with a trick with a laser and like shine it over distance. You can see the horizon when you're at the sea. Like you can go up in an airplane. Like, it's you can see it.
yeah.
But
Well, I think that what flat earthism is about fundamentally is just a rejection of science as a whole.
yeah,
It's
and
like
getting attention.
yes, yes. The whole idea of expertise, right? Like, I'm not going to believe those people. I'm going to do my own research, and my own research involves, digging 2 pages deep on Google, as opposed to spending years studying meticulously the data and the analysis that's been applied by people who are very knowledgeable in these subjects.
For thousands of
Are
years, by the way.
for thousands of years,
Like,
yes. I mean, not just in the context of Western laboratories and stuff, but I mean, indigenous people know how all the plants work because they did trial and error and experimented and figured it out.
yeah.
It's the idea that the scientific method is something that doesn't belong to all people just doesn't hold up very well in my.
No, the scientific method is based on human the way that humans instinctually, all humans think, right?
Yeah.
it is grown out of that, and there's a specific Western tradition, right? But
Mm-hmm.
that is one tradition out of the thousands, right? That
Right.
led to, that just gave names, right? Like, okay, we've got some Greek names that we're using, but it's not like, here in the Americas we weren't using those same methods, right?
Right.
So
Right. And now we get into the trouble about, well, what do we mean by science? Do we mean the scientific method? Do we mean the accumulated body of knowledge that has been accreted by the scientific method, or do we mean
the culture, yeah,
institutions that that are scientific?
yeah,
And the institutions certainly they've had their problems.
absolutely,
I
yeah,
mean, they've been informed by cultural biases,
and they still are,
um, and they still
right?
are, and in some cases they've been influenced by where their funding comes from,
Yes, and
which
yeah,
is another problem. And I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge that and to apply critical thinking and skepticism to what we see. But critical thinking and skepticism doesn't mean I reject the opinion of all experts,
yeah,
or I'm going to find experts who confirm what I already wanted to believe.
hmm,
What it means is having knowledge about how methodology works, understanding what actually, being able to parse out whether a conclusion that's drawn in a paper or a statement actually has any coherence with the
surprised.
findings.
You would be really surprised at how often they don't.
I wouldn't,
Well, you get, yeah.
but
But
I
yeah,
think
you
many
really
would.
gotta, there's
Yeah.
so many, and there's certain fields that it's more of an issue in than others. But you read the conclusion, then you look at the data and you go, That's not, no."
Yeah.
If you were
The,
my student, I'd fail you. How did
you
you get
you
published?
you didn't prove that. And then usually there's a sort of clickbaity headline in the title of the paper,
Hmm.
or certainly the press release that is sent out about the paper, that then further distorts the
Absolutely.
conclusion that was drawn by the paper.
So, yeah, the science journalism is an area with some real challenges
Mm-hmm.
right now.
Yeah.
And there's so much that goes out there. It's just like, that's just not, that it's they're just falsehoods. This is not what was said in that paper, first of all. And, just so I understand where some of the frustration with the science as the institution
Mm-hmm.
is coming from. But then it just gets, and I think that the way that social media is structured right now doesn't help it, because people kind of get wrapped up in this these groups that are forming identities around objecting to science, or othering some particular group, or some, kind of extreme position, or, you know things that are just not supported by the science, or are being represented as science which really aren't scientific, get incorporated into the mainstream, and people go along with these beliefs about, oh, this is what the science says, and it's not. Like,
Right.
show me a single paper. Nope, you can't,
Well,
because it's not
and
there,
and
right?
you complicate and extrapolate that when you have leaders who are hucksters, who articulate these falsehoods, like from the pulpit,
Mm-hmm.
and encourage everybody to disbelieve in anthropogenic climate change, encourage people to, not to believe science, not to believe in evolution, these kinds of things.
And then you have got folks using a lot of that for whatever their particular platform is,
Right.
when it's not, you know, where they're making certain claims or exaggerations that isn't really supported by the science.
Well,
No,
one
okay.
thing that one thing that I have thought about recently is that we really need to make a distinction between skepticism, which is a process of inquiry, and cynicism, which is just the desire to tear everything down that isn't consistent with what you wanted to believe in the first place.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's an awful lot of people out there, including in the atheist community, many of them, who call themselves skeptics, and what they really are is just cynics.
Yeah.
They're not even trying to have an open-minded inquiry into what's likely to be true, so much as they are just trying to tear down everything that they don't like in our lives, in our entertainments, in our politics, in our religious rituals. We do something that we often call suspension of disbelief, but I think what it is more is suspension of skepticism. We choose to turn off that analytical lens that says, like, have you ever sat next to somebody in a movie and they're like, no, that light angle isn't right, this was done with CGI. They're constantly like breaking the spell of the movie. Very frustrating.
My partner won't watch sci-fi with me for that reason.
Oh,
I have to keep my mouth
oh,
shut. I'm like, nope. Gravity doesn't work like that. Stop it.
yeah.
Um,
I
I
mean,
know not
those.
to do it in a movie theater, though.
Okay, well, good. Then we can still be friends.
My lip, but
All right. So suspension of skepticism. I do that when I do my Ethiopian rituals. I certainly do that. In that moment, who am I? I'm a wizard. I'm a manipulator of grand forces in the world. Who's expressing wonder and awe and gratitude for this amazing life, and putting out that I hope that these things will happen in the world. And that doesn't have to be undercut by all the little niggling voices that might try to cynically suck all the juice out of that moment, right?
Mhm.
I don't go to the Grand Canyon and think, well, it's only a hole in the ground. That that doesn't it doesn't feed me in any substantive way. And so I think that the excessive elevation of the technological and the scientific in certain circles anyway. I mean, it may not be quite as bad as the elevation of uninformed religiosity,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still generally, reason, rationality, science are generally in our society, they're viewed by important people, by the people that are in the newspaper and are telling us the news and all that kind of stuff as being important. And
I,
the mythic
mhm.
and the mythic is not given that as much.
Right. I think there's irony in that, though, that I think that there's overall very poor scientific literacy within our culture,
Yes,
right? And so we do elevate that, the science and the rationality, but that I think that we do so in a way that puts it more in that, like,
mythic.
in the mythic box, right? That we
Yeah,
just
because we
kind of
don't understand how it works.
yeah, so we just like, switched what the particular thing is that we're being told to believe and said, oh, it's because it's science, right? But
Mm-hmm.
without understanding science in any of the three ways that we just used the term,
Yes,
right?
yes. And certainly there is little effort to foster scientific literacy in the United States, certainly. I think that's less true in some other places. And so we're kind of forced to treat science as this magical black box that answers questions for us and that technologies fall out of,
Mm-hmm.
that we then get to use and buy and
And
enjoy.
has certain fonts and colors associated with it.
Yeah.
And yes, and little beep boops and sounds like that, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. And we insist on that, right? There's a particular kind of look and feel to a computer that will sell a computer, and there's a look and feel that will not sell a computer. And the people that make computers know very well what the difference is.
Right. And if you are a college kid going into one of those fields, you are expected to look and behave a certain way and
Mm-hmm.
not another way, right?
Right.
And that
Right.
gets taught to us from when we're itty bitty.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and this is part of the challenge because we have accumulated enough knowledge now that no one can encompass all of it.
Hmm.
It's just not possible within a lifetime and one human brain. So you kind of have to specialize. Especially if you're really going to go into a subject, you have to specialize. But for a general scientific literacy, it's it's a work of many years. It's a work of a lifetime, honestly. I
Hmm.
mean, because there's always new stuff being discovered. So, I'm always reading Science Daily and nature.com and scientificamerican.com just to kind of keep up with the very tiny crust on the surface of all the stuff that's being done out there.
This is actually the subject that, assuming that they approve it, that I'm doing my dissertation in for my doctorate in STEM education is scientific literacy. It's public
Ah,
literacy, yeah.
cool.
So there's not as much research in the area as you would think there would be.
Uh-huh.
When I started looking into it, it's like, oh, this is going to be a saturated field, but it's not. There's very little.
Well, new paths to scientific literacy would certainly be welcome. I mean, I know that you're a very strong critic of the traditional American education system. I am too. But the question is, how then do people absorb
Right.
knowledge?
And I'm definitely looking at it from the adult perspective rather
Ah,
than the children, because we do most of our learning as adults,
mm-hmm,
right? Certainly, most kids in this country go through a school system, and there's a lot of people working on that. And, we could do a whole episode on the critiques that I have of the system of school itself and how we've confused that with education and,
yes.
what the purpose of it is. But as a scientist, I learned a few things in school, right? I learned some how to do some processes and things like that, but the vast majority of what I know happened just because I was interested in the topic and just continued to
Mm-hmm.
learn it. And I think that most people learn that way as well.
Yeah, that's
Um,
certainly true for me. I mean, It's all been about deep dives into stuff that I'm curious about. I mean, one of the Atheopagan principles is curiosity, understanding that there's always more to be learned, right? And learning is a wonderful process. It's a pleasurable process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only that it informs you more, but it's joyful.
Yeah.
And joyful things are things we're in favor of. So
Right.
go out and learn something today.
Well, learning is something that we continue to do no matter what. We are humans, and that's part of what we do, but
Uh-huh.
we can be intentional about it or unintentional about it,
Right.
right?
Right.
So,
Yeah. So talking about truth and reality.
you did, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about quantum mechanics, and you said you wanted to touch on the idea that measurement and,
Oh
and
yes. Yes.
observation, I
This is
don't know how to
one
tie this in.
you can hear the exasperation in my voice as when this comes up, because there are so many people. There are people in the pagan community, people in the new age community, people in various other kind of religious communities for whom quantum mechanics, which they usually call quantum physics, is
A
a
stand-in for magic?
yes. Yes, it's a you wave your hands vaguely in a gesture at this, and what you mean is we don't understand it, and therefore it is the cause of the thing I want to believe in. And one of the experiments and findings in quantum mechanics that is most misinterpreted is the idea that an observation affects the 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 decoherence of a superposition
Mm-hmm.
particle wavicle phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's not what observation means in physics. What an observation means in physics is a measurement. And a measurement necessarily requires an interaction. And that's what causes decoherence. That's what causes a quantum body to be affected, is interaction with its environment. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not that your consciousness is changing anything in the quantum world. We have no evidence ever that that is true. It's that in the act of trying to figure out what one of those particles is doing, you have to interact with it. As soon
Right.
as you interact with it, it decoheres.
Right.
And then you can take a measurement, but you're not measuring the thing that you originally were reaching towards with your measuring stick. You're
So,
measuring what it became after the interaction.
so let me give a kind of an analogy on a larger scale. So I want to see where something is, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
in order for me to see it, light has to bounce off of it and that has to go into my eye. So it had to interact, that photon
Mm-hmm.
had to interact with it in order for me to be able to see it, right? So that's on a bigger scale, but that's going to apply on our small scale as well.
Exactly. Exactly. And unfortunately, there was quite a lot of gobbledygook published about quantum mechanics early in its history, which has sort of mucked up the waters and created a lot more of this sense of, wow, quantum mechanics is very weird and mysterious. Well, it is weird and mysterious, but it's not nearly as weird and mysterious as a lot of people seem to think it is.
Yeah,
We've learned a good bit about it. The big mystery, of course, is where's the theory of everything? How do you get classical physics, relativistic physics to work with quantum mechanics, because they clash?
right.
So that's the big mystery. There's a lot of very smart people working on it, and maybe someday we'll know the answer to that.
It's delightful because each of those different approaches are very, very good at explaining specific phenomena, but completely fall apart when trying to explain other ones. So we know they're both wrong,
Yeah,
right? And that's
yeah,
delightful. That's really
yep.
fun to think about.
We know that both of those systems are flawed, and to the degree that we understand them at all, we understand that they don't mesh very
Yeah.
well. They contradict one another.
But they are still useful,
Oh yeah,
right? And this happens in physics all over the place. We're going to calculate the path of the baseball that I throw, and I'm not I'm not including all of the different little pieces of information. I'm not going to get it exactly, but I'm going to get it close enough to what I need for it to be useful, and I'm just going to do what I need for it to be useful,
Right.
right?
Right. So
I
in
was
the
going to say,
context,
yeah,
go ahead.
you were saying with a lot of the gobbledygook that's been published about it, there's also a lot of things that I come across, especially when teaching, where there's a lot of confusion between what are some really cool ideas, like when people talk about like multiverses or things like that, like those are very interesting ideas, but they're not science, right? And there's and do we know whether string theory is correct or things like, or a few months ago, speaking about the bad reporting, saying that, oh, scientists created a black hole like, no, they didn't. There was a computer program that they ran with conditions that were slightly different than our universe, in which they were able to simulate and show that a black hole would form under these conditions, right? Like, so there's a lot of stuff out there that is science fiction that may one day become science, right? But it's not science until it's falsifiable, right? Can't falsify, but it's not science right now, and it gets treated like it is, right? And it can be so confusing.
Yeah, exactly. And when you have a population of people who, to begin with, aren't very scientifically literate, but are looking for kind of mysterious forces that might serve as an explanation for things that they choose to believe in, well, quantum mechanics is a pretty good candidate because it has a little weirdness about it, and it's at a scale that's invisible to us with the naked eye, so we don't actually have to deal with it at all. We can just sort of use it as this placeholder for the magic thing that I wish existed.
And there are a few things that when you hear about, they kind of do sound a little magic-y. Quantum tunneling sounds pretty magic-y to me, right? When you think about it, or you're like, okay, yeah, entanglement, that sounds pretty magic-y.
Yeah, Bell's theorem, the simultaneous snapping into identical spin of particles that are separated by parsecs, right? So yes, I mean there are things that are mysterious and weird, and they point in the direction of new learning that we need to do.
Yeah.
If the data's good, because it's possible that our instruments are not perfect too, right?
Or that we're missing something, that we're interpreting something in the wrong way. Is always possible. So something that I think a lot about is, are you familiar with the idea of the ether? The luminiferous ether? Okay.
Yeah.
So we used to think, it was quite common to think that there had to be some sort of substance that light was traveling through, because all the other waves that we knew of went through something, right? Sound goes through the air, ocean waves go through the water. So what's light going through? So there was this assumption that there was this something permeating the universe. And I'm trying to remember the names of the two gentlemen who set this up. I'm going to look this up real quick so that I get the name of it right. So, okay. The Michelson-Morley experiment, right? So it was trying to measure the relative motion of the Earth in the ether. And they did it over and over again, and they kept not finding the ether because we don't think it exists today, right? And they said, okay, maybe we need to make it bigger and bigger and bigger. Maybe, it's just too small. That experiment the setup for it is almost identical to how LIGO works, which is the gravitational wave observatory. So if we had somehow been able to make it large enough that it would have been able to pick up gravitational waves, we would have interpreted the gravitational waves at the time as being evidence for the ether.
Yeah.
So who knows today what we've found that we're interpreting as being evidence for one thing, which is something completely different. And we're going off in some direction and we're totally wrong about it. You know, science is a self-correcting process, so at some point hopefully we'll circle back around and correct it. But I personally suspect that most of what we think we know, we're wrong about.
Hmm.
But we don't really have a way of knowing that yet.
Right.
So,
Right.
but that particular example just delights me that, if we had been able to make it 4 kilometers long, we would have detected gravitational waves instead of ether.
Uh-huh.
So,
On a completely unrelated note, ether is a very useful trope in steampunk
it is,
design
yes.
and fiction and all that kind of stuff. My partner and I did an etheric explorers ball party,
Ooh.
steampunk party that was so much fun. This must be 10, 12 years ago now, but oh God, what a good time.
I think I've seen some photos of you in your outfit for
Oh
it.
yes, Commander Basterton,
Yes. Oh,
who
that's a great name.
conquered Mars for the Empire.
Mm.
Yeah, Raleigh Houghton Basterton, whose men call him really rotten Basterton.
That's great.
Yeah, pretty fun. I still have some of the business cards. Commander of Her Majesty's Imperial Ship Improbable.
Mm. That's a good one. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of good material for sci-fi out of all this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And once again, that's the mythic. I mean,
Mm.
one of the things that's great about speculative fiction generally, science fiction and fantasy, is that it speculates, right? It reaches out into the future or into alternate realities that put human or human-like figures
People,
into
we'll
different
just say.
contexts,
Hmm.
and then conjectures about, well, what would it be like? What would happen? What where would we go?
Hmm.
And those are wonderful rides to take, and they're often very illuminating when you take those rides and you learn something more about humanity itself by seeing it reflected in that kind of a mirror.
Hmm.
So I guess, because we've been talking for a while now, I guess to sum up, I both feel that we need a lot more emphasis on the verifiably, factually, objectively true in the way of increasing scientific literacy and curiosity. But we also need to elevate the mythic and the emotional and the the passionate.
Hmm.
You know, there's so much discounting of, I mean, arguably the rudest thing that you can say to someone is you're just being emotional, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm being emotional. I'm angry.
Yes. Which is so interesting because it's one of the things that and of course, other animals turning out seem to share most of the closer they are to us, the more things they seem to share with us.
Yeah,
But that's one of the things that we pride ourselves about. Oh, that's being so human, right? And then,
right.
oh, look at you, shame on you for being so human.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that it would really benefit us to focus more on thinking about thinking,
Yes.
right? Whether that whichever type of thinking or the purpose, but just being more conscious of what our beliefs are, why we have those, and learning to reflect upon those.
Well, yes. I mean, Socrates, right? Know thyself.
Hmm.
Self inquiry is, for one thing, it's an amazing journey because each of us really is unique and you will discover unique and amazing things about yourself, right? And since we don't come with an operating manual, it can be very helpful to know what your predilections are, what your prejudices are, what your confirmation biases are,
Which,
and
if you
to work
decide
with
that you want to
those.
change them, you got to know what they are to be able to make those, to
That's it.
direct the change of them, They may change over time. They probably will. But if you want to influence where they go, you need to be aware of them.
You need to know what they are. Yeah, it's the full denial of inquiry that I think is really the pernicious problem that we contend with. And it's not just among, say, fundamentalist, evangelical Christians. It's among some in the pagan community as well, who know what they know and are not asking questions anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I can't stop asking questions. I'm just too curious.
Yep. Well, this is fun. I think this is a topic we should circle back around to in the future. And I think it's related to so many things we talk about, but it's important to think about, what do we mean when we say real and true and reality and
Right.
what's all that
Well,
stuff?
yeah, because it's at the core of everything, right? I mean, we act based on what we believe is real, what we believe is likely to be the truth of the outcome that we project. We get ourselves scrambled and confused most when we do something and we get a completely random response that doesn't fit our projection of what we thought was going to happen.
Right.
So knowing what we believe and knowing why we came to believe it becomes very important.
Right. And if we want to change it,
Yes.
how do we, knowing that it's there so that we can choose and have that agency in our own lives,
Right.
and not just be, being blown along the path. So,
Yep.
all
Yep.
right.
It's a choose your own adventure. Either that or you can just be washed around.
Just trademarked, by the way.
Is it?
They got that the company goes after people for using that.
Oh
So
wow.
it has to be a choose your own story, or write your own adventure. So,
Oh man.
yeah. All right. Well,
Let's
Mark,
not
this
get
was
started
fun.
on litigiousness. That's a whole
Yeah.
other topic. All right. Well, it's great spending time with you as always, folks. It's great spending time with you, Yucca. And we'll see you next week.
September. Yep.
Yeah.